he read to her. And there were really only two books, and this is why I say a 19th century American education. There were really only two books in most homes in America at that time, because books were expensive. In the second half of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, books were expensive. And so what were those books? The King James Version of the Bible and the complete works of William Shakespeare. And so they read to each other. And as I got older, she encouraged me to read those books. And the thought behind having those two books and why those two books is because most people felt, and I continue to agree, that most of the wisdom that you need is in those two books. They really are, and they're both well written too. And so she had a rote memory, and an amazing rote memory. And she could, rattle off one of Shakespeare's soliloquies. She could spout, a Psalms. She was pretty amazing. And so she sort of got me hooked on the printed word at a very early age. And I always thought it was, important for me to someday be a writer for her. But I also knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and so those two things sort of worked together. But where she gave me a sense of perspective, my father had passed away, my three siblings had married, so it was just her and I together a lot when I was home from college, just the two of us. And she's discussing with me her childhood, those 11 years where it was just her and her father. And she's talking about a home in which there's no electricity, a home in which there's no indoor plumbing. The water is, cranked to pump and fill up a pail. Baths were, maybe once a month. Heat up a bunch of water and sit in the tub and wash yourself off. And you needed to relieve yourself, you had to go outside to an outhouse. And really cold nights, there was a bedpan under the bed, so you didn't have to go stumbling in the dark. And it gives you a real perspective on how different life once was in this country versus what it is today. And she gets up, we're sitting in the kitchen talking. She gets up and she shuts off the light. She turns it back on. She shuts off the light. And this is after she's telling me how she read Shakespeare by a kerosene lamp. And she sits back down and she says, a lot of things have to go right for those lights to come on. And if they don't, you're going to be fumbling in the dark for matches. And she then said, the more complicated, and this has stayed with me, I was like 19 or so, 20 when she said this, the more complicated a society, the more vulnerable it is. And I can only imagine what she would think of today's society with our dependence upon, the internet and Wi-Fi connections and all those things, because if the electricity ever does go out for any length of time, we're going to really be scrambling, period. We would have big problems. But I always felt like I needed to write a book. And when I got to college, I was a Protestant in a Catholic university, which really didn't bother me at all, because there really wasn't, religion wasn't shoved down your throat at all. It was a very serious school, and I was very happy to be there. But I did get interest in one religious thinker, St. Augustine, because I found that St. Augustine really had a keen perspective on human nature. He really understood human nature, and his book, The City of God, really captured me. And I said, somebody ought to write a book on St. Augustine's political philosophy. And then I became impressed with Machiavelli, the guy who wrote The Prince. And I, thought he's interesting. But I get married, I start practicing law. I get elected to the Freeholder Board, which is now the County Commissioners, a couple times. I run for the Assembly in 1979. I lose. A friend that I had made during that campaign, a gentleman who was city councilman in Atlantic City, Peter Hollingsworth, says to me, how would you like to be planning board attorney? And I'm like, that sounds terrific. I figured this would be a lot of fun, okay? And so around the same time that I take on that position, I'm coming to the realization that you ain't ever going to write a book on St. Augustine because you don't read Latin well enough. And you're never going to write a book on Machiavelli because you don't read Old Italian, because he wrote in Old Italian. I mean, translations are translations. You really do need to read original works of things. And I'll explain to you more about that as I go forward. So I gave up on Augustine. I mean, I haven't given up on Augustine. He's still one of the great thinkers of all time. And I gave up on Machiavelli, and every now and then I meet people who I think, you know, they sort of bring the two together, and those are really complicated people, and I've met people like that, or research people like that. Not met people, research people like that. So around that time that I am, you know, struggling with the fact that I'm not going to write a book on St. Augustine or Machiavelli, I began representing the planning board. And I went into City Hall knowing it was corrupt. That didn't bother me because I had confidence that I knew how to keep a distance. I know how to insulate myself. And you know, and I would tell some of the planning staff, you gotta write a memo on that one. You had a conversation, memorialize it, don't lose that. And when indictments came, some of the people that I advised were, you know, they had their memos that they took to the grand jury and read from, and they were fine. You know, and those that weren't smart enough to do it had problems of their own. And so I'm representing the planning board, and I'm spending a lot of time in City Hall. And I said, you know, the corruption doesn't bother me because that's the norm here. But the dysfunctionality makes me crazy. Why can't they get anything done? And so, because of my experience with my mother and books and libraries, and she instilled in me the belief that if you want to know something, you want to seek the answer to something, you need to go. Wow. Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Great to see you.
I just happened to read the Gazette and knew you were here.
I'm delighted to see you. This is a long friend of mine, Bill Duffy. And so around the time that I'm like mentally giving up on a couple issues, and I'm trying to make sense of Atlantic City, I go to the library because that's they will have the answer. You know. So I had the good fortune of meeting two women, Jane Spittler and Marie Boyd, and I love them both. They're both long gone, but they're lovely women. And I told them my dilemma. One of them was really politically savvy, and the other one was very historically savvy. And so they start feeding me books. And after about a year and a half, and I've read close to 20 books, I come with three takeaways. I said, first, nobody has written a complete history of the town. All of these books are like you know, wedges out of a pie. Nobody wrote the whole pie. I mean, there are books on the Boardwalk, books on the hotels, books on Atlantic City as a tryout town for Broadway, books on Atlantic City's vaudeville shows, books on midget wrestling, books on fire companies, books on schools, books on Miss America, books on rolling chairs. I mean, a lot of books, okay, about a lot of different subjects. But I said nobody had ever tied it all together. That's pretty amazing, okay? The next thing that I realized that, and I know my dates are safe, so I really did my research on that one. Between 1880 and 1930, more than 90% of the hotel workforce was African American. So if you remove the African American experience from Atlantic City's history, town never comes to be. What is it? I don't know. Brigantine, Seattle City. But it's not a resort that could host 250,000 people during the first 2 decades of the 20th century and the last decade of the 19th century. Impossible without that workforce. And then the third thing that really impressed me was the failure to talk about corruption. Because none of the books really dealt with corruption. And when you found newspaper articles, it was always through rose-colored glasses, you know. And what I learned was that corruption in Atlantic City, in old Atlantic City, and people will argue today too, but corruption in old Atlantic City was organic. It was perfectly natural, and it was necessary. If you have a 12, 10, 14-day window in which to host visitors, you have to give them what they want. And so, before Prohibition, there was bishops' laws. After Prohibition, was a crazy place. But when the people who came to town, they needed to leave happy. I mean, every business, the success of every business is repeat business. And so Atlantic City understood, and in the very beginning of Boardwalk Empire, I quote an old lawyer that I had become friendly with, Murray Fredericks, and he was the lawyer for the organization, for Hap Farley's organization, Murray Fredericks. And I was pressing him on why is Atlantic City so corrupt? And his response was that the people who came to town had wanted Bible readings, we'd have given them that. But nobody ever asked for Bible readings. They wanted booze, broads, and gambling, so that's what we gave them. And so corruption was necessary because to give booze, broads, and gambling, you have to bend the law. And so this guy, that's the cover of Boardwalk Empire. Let's go to the next one. This guy was an amazing guy. No relation. I wish he was, because if he was, I would have had more stories about him. But Nucky Johnson wore two hats the way nobody else I know of in 20th century American history was able to wear two hats. He was a serious player in organized crime, and he was a serious player in Republican politics in New Jersey, and to some extent in national politics at conventions and whatnot. He was able to make deals with somebody we're going to talk about in a second, a guy named Frank Hague, and the two of them together could pretty much get their way in picking who was going to be the next governor. And they did that for quite a while. And Nucky, as I said, he had a foot in the legitimate world of politics. He had a foot in the world of organized crime. And he really understood how to organize things. He was an organizer. The guy who preceded him, the Commodore, was sort of a boss, but he had no sense of organization. Johnson had a true organization. And so I'm reading all this, and when I understood he had gone to jail, and the reasons he had gone to jail, I said I have to get my hands on the FBI transcript of the record of the investigation, and took me quite a while to get it because it was before the Freedom of Information Act, and I had to reach out to Bill Bradley, who was senator at the time, and I had gotten to know him when he came to Hamilton to campaign, and so he got the FBI to release the report to me. And it just made my head explode when I read the report, because you've got this team of investigators coming to town, and they're talking about how wide open the town is and how confident they will be able to get indictments within 6 months. Took them 6 years. And why? Because nobody would talk. People would rather go to jail than talk against Nucky. Well, they eventually got Nucky on tax evasion, and he went to jail. And so the book on Boardwalk Empire does what it does. I mean, what inspired me to finish the book and push it, because I knew Nucky was fit for film. I just knew he was a character that somebody would want to do something with. And it's a very long story short. My daughter was living in LA. My nephew was living in LA. I would fly out for pitch festivals. You know, they would pick me up at the airport, and I would pitch the books. And I had the good fortune of meeting a gentleman who said, you know, when I was a kid, we used to vacation in Atlantic City. He was from Patterson. And he said, I could always tell when my father's business was doing well, we would go for 2 weeks. And when his business wasn't doing so well, we only went for 1 week. But we always stayed at the same kosher hotel. And so he asked for several copies of the book. I gave them to him. He spread the books around. And about 3 months after that meeting, I get a phone call from an agent, and everything just goes from there. And you know the rest. There's a TV series. This book, The North Side, I knew I had to write it because I knew the indispensable role. And I also knew I had to write it because I knew I would be able to write it. The gentleman who wrote the preface to this book, Clement Price, was asked by a reporter friend of mine from the Newark Star-Ledger to read the book to see if he would write a preface for the book. Clement Price was an African-American scholar at Rutgers. He was state historian up until the time he died. And so Clement writes the book, reads the book. Clement agrees to do a preface to the book. I have breakfast with him and my friend Mark, the reporter, in Newark one morning, and I'm walking into the restaurant, and I could see Mark saying to Clement, here he comes. And he stands up and he says to me, I thought you were African American. He said, Nelson Johnson. He said, you read and write like a black man. And so we had a really long talk. And I explained to him, about my mother's roots and about my, that whole sort of thing. And he was like, that's okay. Now I understand things a little bit better. But and he was a wonderful man, died of a stroke, unfortunately. But I tell people Boardwalk Empire was not rejected 100 times. But it was rejected about 70 times. It got to the point where my secretary and I just lost track, and we no longer saved rejection letters. And so it really is about persistence. But again, I saw how persistent my mother was in her life and the things she had to overcome, and me being in college when my father passes away, and her and I sitting down, and she's saying to me, you're going to work every summer, and I'm going to work every day, and I'm going to put away money, and you're going to put away money. But when you go to school, your full-time job is to be a student. That is your job, and you must apply yourself. And I did, and everything worked out well. Wound up Villanova Law School on a scholarship, and then things worked out well. But let's go to the next slide. What really kept me going in the writing of the North Side was this gentleman's history. Claiborne Morris Cade, his personal life and my personal life were so similar, and they were similar in this regard. His family had to make big sacrifices for him to get an education, and for him and for me, there really was no margin for failure. How the hell do you go home and tell your mother you failed out of school? How do you tell you didn't do your very best? When she's doing everything for you. And so, and he went, and I had the good fortune of getting my hands, I have my friend Ralph Hunter to thank for this, and I think I have my friend Ralph Hunter to thank for that. Basically his estate papers. Amazing letters and telegrams, and he was an extraordinary person. But he's what made me say, you got to write this book. And so I wrote the book, and let's go to the next one. Now, when I'm researching Boardwalk Empire, I come across the relationship between Nucky Johnson and this guy on the left, Frank Hague. Frank Hague was mayor of Jersey City and the most powerful person in New Jersey for about 25 years. The guy with him is Arthur Vanderbilt, who was a very successful lawyer from Newark. He was a Teddy Roosevelt Republican. Back in those days, and I'm talking now the 20s and the 30s, the populations of Essex County and Hudson County were more than a third of the state's population. And so if those two counties could agree, they could pretty much get anything they want. But those two guys could not agree. And when I'm researching Boardwalk Empire, I see Johnson's relationship with Hague. Hague was a Democrat, Johnson was a Republican. They would help one another this is before the laws that prevented people from crossing over and voting in the other party's primary. Those laws didn't come into existence about the 50s or the 60s. So back in the 10s, the 20s, and the 30s, if you were registered to vote and you showed up, you could vote whatever primary you wanted to vote, okay? So there were times when Johnson would have Republican voters in South Jersey vote in a Democratic primary to help Hague with his candidate. And there was just the opposite one time when Walter Edge, ACC's campus, Walter Edge Hall, well, Walter Edge was elected governor twice. And the first time he got elected, he won the Republican primary in Hudson County by more than 3,000 votes. And there weren't that many Republicans in Hudson County because everybody was Democrat. And I say everybody was Democrat because what was going on during Hague's reign was a religious war. You had the Irish Catholics who had their face rubbed in the dirt so bad by the Protestant wasps that Haig said, it's payback time. And so Haig spent most of his career making the Republicans pay for it. Haig was a tough sucker. But I'm reading about him when I'm reading Boardwalk Empire, and I said, this guy's an interesting guy. And I said, when you were in college, you read a couple chapters in a book called, what was the title of the book? The Boss, The Haig Machine in Action. That was the title of the book. And I would, stuck in my brain this guy Haig, and then I'm reading about him, and I'm reading about Johnson and how the two of them would, play votes with one another. And so then on her 60th birthday, we take a trip to Sicily, which is where a good portion of her family's from. My wife Joanna, my bride, and I take this book with me about this guy, Arthur Vanderbilt. It's written by his grandson. His grandson's a pretty accomplished historian, and he's a pretty decent writer. But I'm reading the book, and Haig comes up in the book, and I say to myself, I'm sorry, he missed the story. Because the story was the conflict between those two guys, okay? So then I said, hey, then maybe that's a book. And I start researching, and long story short, I get a book. Rutgers agrees to publish it. Rutgers and I could not agree upon the title. I thought the title should be Street Fight, because that's really what it was. But that wasn't an academic type title. And so it became Battleground New Jersey, but I've had a lot of fun with that book. The Chief Justice has basically told all the judges, you need to read this book. You need to understand how we got to where we are. Because New Jersey judiciary is very respected throughout the country. We are a role model and a trendsetter and we're innovators. And if it wasn't for Arthur Vanderbilt, we wouldn't be that. I mean, he really was persistent. His problem was he didn't know how to compromise. He just wanted to fight. And it took a guy from Haddonfield, Alfred Driscoll, who got elected governor in 1946. And he looked at the landscape and he said, let's make a deal with Haig. He's got all these votes, and we can get a referendum passed if we just get him on our side. And Driscoll did make a deal, and Vanderbilt was upset about making a deal with the likes of Frank Haig, but Vanderbilt went on to become the first Chief Justice and was a very good first Chief Justice and did some very important things for the court system, and I continue to have tremendous respect for him. Let's go to. That's Arthur Vanderbilt. He was nationally known as a judicial reformer, but he couldn't get reform at his own state, and it really made him crazy. She and I spent a weekend in Connecticut at Wesleyan University, and I went through all his files and some of the letters, that he saved and wrote. I mean, he had hundreds of folders. But I had a roadmap from his grandson as to which ones I should be looking at, and it was good. It was good. But he was obsessed with reform, but he couldn't get reform in his own state. So it took a younger, less experienced politician who knew how to compromise to make it all happen. Let's go to the next one. And this is Frank Haig. Frank Haig was born on the kitchen table in a row house in Jersey City. He was kicked out of school for being incorrigible in the 6th grade. He went on to be head janitor at City Hall. From there, he got elected to the City Commission. From there, he became mayor, and he was mayor for the next 30 plus years. Frank Haig and Arthur Vanderbilt, they were both very similar in this regard. You were either attracted to them or you were repelled from them. They were the kind of people that you either were excited by their energy or you were turned off by it. And Haig was a real tough sucker. And what I mean by that, one of the great things about doing research and going to libraries and meeting people is you run into people that I call folk historians. And these are guys that are like curators. They have their own little museums, and they collect books, and they collect news articles, and they interview people. And they just do it for their own personal satisfaction. So I'm in the Jersey City Library, and the librarian says to me, you want to meet Frank Lynch? You think he's coming in today? So I meet with Frank Lynch, and I met with him a couple times after that. And he proceeded to tell me a story that his father told him, which was this: somewhere Frank Hague is in his 50s, 52, 53, I'm not sure, he wasn't 60, but somewhere in his 50s, he's having a conversation. His father's in this same meeting. He's having a conversation with somebody, and the conversation does not go well. Hague gets up, and this guy in his 50s. Hague gets up, and the other guy's in his 50s. Hague gets up and punches the guy right in the face and knocks him out of his chair. I mean, that's how aggressive Frank Hague was, and he was a very shrewd tactician politically. It's the power that he accrued and had during. And here's the amazing thing about him, and please take this the right way. Like Hap Farley, they never were able to indict him. They were never able to charge him with anything. I mean, as corrupt as they both were, they were that smart that they knew how to stay out of the clutches of the law. And you have to respect that. I mean, whether you like it or not, you have to respect that shrewdness, that ability to manipulate other people, that you control your world and you do the things you want, and legally you never have to pay for it. Because they were that shrewd, they were that smart. And so I admire Frank Hague a great deal. Do I like him? No. But do I admire him and respect him? Yeah, because he was anything but warm and fuzzy, but amazing character to research about. Now this guy, Clarence Darrow, this gentleman gave me a copy of Irving Stone's book, Darrow for the Defense, many years ago. I have it at home still, and I was going to bring this book to you, and I hadn't had a chance yet. I spoke to your son. Any event, Bill Duffy and I go way back. I'm really happy you're here.
Thank you.
Good to see you. At the age of 5, I decided that I wanted to be a lawyer. I'm in a car with my father and my grandfather, and I'm talking, and my grandfather says, "Nelson, you talk so much, you should be a lawyer." And I said, "What's a lawyer?" Where did he have this answer? He could have said anything. A lawyer is someone who helps people when they're in trouble. Well, my mother had always taught me that the reason we exist is to help one another. Because why else do we exist if we're not here to help one another? It doesn't make any sense to fight with one another. And so I said, that's interesting. So I went home, asked my mother, what's a lawyer do? And she explained, and then by the time I was in my 3rd grade, I had been to visit Vince DeMarco's office, and by the time I was in the 5th grade, I had sat in municipal court and watched things go on, and that's it, But I really did have a very uncomplicated life, because think about it, no decisions, no anxiety, no worries. You just know what you're going to do, and you do it. And I had the good fortune of being able to do that. And so this guy, I read about him when I'm like 13 years old. I read a paperback version. Bill gave me a hard copy. A paperback version of Darrow for the Defense by Irving Stone. When Joanna and I go to Washington Library of Congress to research, we find that Stone's book was in very large part written based upon his wife Ruby's letters, because Ruby was a journalist who gave up her career to support the man that she thought would become the most famous lawyer in American history, and she was right. Let's go to the next one with Darrow. Clarence was an amazing self-promoter. He had some really big cases that got national recognition. You may have heard of Leopold and Loeb, the 2 teenagers who murdered a young boy. You may have heard of the Scopes monkey trial on evolution. There was a movie called Inherit the Wind, starring Spencer Tracy. But what had always interested, let's go to, and this is Ruby. What most historians don't appreciate is Darrow was brilliant as hell, but eccentric as hell. And so if you gave him a really interesting book and he sat down in that chair, he might stay there until he finished it. And you'd be turning out the lights and he'd be saying, what's going on? He could get disconnected from the world. And Ruby was sort of the one who winded him up and pointed him in the right direction, because scheduling train trips, scheduling hotels, you know, getting him to the barber. He did not care about the little things of life. He was just focused on the big issues. Truth is, and this is something that a lot of biographers gloss over, he really wasn't all that keen on the law. He was keen on the battle. He always wanted to fight for the underdog. He always wanted to fight for the person who was being kicked. And let's go to the next slide. What happens, and we're going to talk about him in a quick, but what happens is I got interested in there's been so many books, and this is unusual, and any of you have come across these, you'll know what I'm talking about. There have been so many books written on Clarence Darrow, and so many essays and articles, that there's a published bibliography. Now, who gets bibliographies? Lincoln, the two Roosevelts, Jesus. I mean, I'm not being a smartass. I mean, for somebody to write a book about all the books written about you, that's a pretty big deal. She and I, it was a November day about 15 years ago. We go to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, and it's a rainy day. And it was a wonderful Coopers. If you ever been there, it's an amazing place. You go. Cooperstown is wonderful. And we find this big used bookstore, and I'm looking for a book on something on Greek history, and she's just looking for books. And the next thing, and she knows I'm thinking about Darrow at the time, and she comes up to me and she said, "There's a bibliography on the life of Clarence Darrow." Blew my mind. So obviously we bought that. And it was a good source in terms of finding all the books that have been written about him. And what I learned, I probably read about 15 books on Darrow, and there's been a lot more. But first of all, nobody appreciated how eccentric he was, and nobody appreciated that they didn't want to talk about the fact that the law didn't interest him as much as the fight interested him. And so Darrow becomes the champion of the labor movement at the end of the 19th century. And he's representing the coal miners, he's representing the gold miners, the silver miners, he's representing the iron workers, he's representing the brand new AFL, before it became the AFL-CIO. The first was the American Federation of Labor, headed by Samuel Gompers. So he's representing them, and this has become his career for about 20 years, and how he got there's a whole other story. But for about 20 years, he's representing the labor movement, and they are his clients. And in 1910, after he had represented a guy named Big Bill Haywood, who was one of the miners' union people charged with murder, and it was 3 years, 3 different trials involving different people, and he was totally exhausted. In October of 1910, this gentleman's newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, is exploded. And I mean exploded in a very big way. The jackass, one of the McNamara brothers, put the dynamite next to barrels of ink. He didn't know they were barrels of ink. He thought he was just going to set off a noisy explosion that might put a dent in one of the walls. He set off an explosion that started a huge fire, set the whole building on fire. The printing press caves through the floor, hits a gas main. There's another explosion. 20 people die, and they arrest the two brothers after a 6-month manhunt. And so the labor movement comes to Chicago and says to Darrow, "You need to represent the brothers." And he doesn't want to, and Ruby doesn't want him to do it either. I mean, Ruby was really vehement. Look, he's paid his dues. Let somebody else do this. Find another lawyer. They didn't care. They just leaned on him until he said yes. So he goes there, and everybody BS's him because the labor movement knew that the brothers had done this. Okay, but they wanted Darrow to defend them, get them acquitted, and vindicate the labor movement. Okay, he's there about 2-3 months, and he says they're guilty. I can't do anything to save them. And the guy who was handling the case was a candidate for California Supreme Court. He would have loved nothing more than to hang these two brothers. And so Darrow, who was very much opposed to the death penalty, Darrow, with the help of a guy named Lincoln Steffens, who was the first muckraking journalist in history, and a brilliant guy and respected by a lot of people for his work, and they negotiated a plea bargain. Not long after the plea bargain is negotiated, Darrow is charged with a crime himself. Now, why did I have his picture up here? I have his picture up here because he absolutely hated Clarence Darrow. And he wanted Clarence Darrow in jail. And so, how did the indictment come about? We're never really going to know that. Okay, the indictment was for the attempting to bribe a juror who had yet to be called for jury selection, because in those days jury selection could go on a long time, and it was a murder trial involving two brothers, and very controversial case. And so the process was going on and on and on. And one of the people who was part of the jury pool but never called supposedly was bribed. Okay, was he? Did Darrow work behind the scenes to try to bribe this guy? I don't think so, because there was so much money involved, and Darrow was so tight with a buck. It was hard to believe that Darrow was involved. But any event, a book that I came across who focused on this trial found that Darrow was guilty. I mean, this is what the author said. Darrow was guilty, even though he was acquitted. Darrow was guilty. And I'm like, I'm not buying that. As a lawyer and as a judge, jury verdicts are supposed to mean something, and it bothered me. So I'm reading the book, and I'm looking to, what are you citing when you're saying these different things about what happened at trial? And he's citing newspaper articles. There were 12 newspapers in Los Angeles at the time, 2 Sundays and 10 dailies. But do you think everybody had their own angle? Because I represented the newspaper for years, the press, and 2 different reporters could see things completely differently. And especially when you start talking about a trial, you're talking about lay people talking about things that they may not even appreciate what they're looking at. And so, very long story short, going back to my mother's love for libraries and getting me, my library card when I was 4 years old, I find a librarian, University of Minnesota Law School, and became friendly with him. We've had several conferences on the phone and going back and forth in email. And he says to me, I got access to the trial transcript of Darrow's trial, where he was charged with attempting to bribe a juror. I said, well, I want to read it. His response was, do you realize what you're doing here? And I said, well, tell me. He said, it's 90 volumes, and it's more than 8,000 pages. The trial was 12 weeks long. I said, well, I'm not going to know if I like it until I start it. So I didn't get it in paper. He had gotten a grant, he had gotten it digitized, and so I was able to download. Took my secretary a better part of that. No, I wasn't able. She was able to download these 90 things, and so I begin reading them. I'm an early riser, so I dedicated from 4:30 to 6:30 in the morning to begin reading them and making notes before I went to the courthouse, and I had to continue that, after I was off the bench, and it was such an exciting read for somebody like me, because I could see what was going on in the courtroom, and the judge was a really nice man, and I think he was bright, but when I researched him, his background was in Western water rights. He had no experience in criminal law. And let's go to the next slide. And this guy, and it's not like I didn't discover this guy. This guy is in the Trial Lawyers Hall of Fame. This is Earl Rogers. Earl Rogers was a legal genius. See, Darrow was in a strange land with a bunch of strangers. He needed to have local counsel. Ruby didn't like this guy because Ruby's attitude was he's too much of a showman. And he was a bit of a showman. I mean, look at the way he's dressed. Gary Cooper, Clark Gable sought out his tailor because he dressed so well. But if you understand him, and if you read what his daughter wrote an extensive, his daughter won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, his daughter won a Pulitzer Prize, and she was a screenwriter and a journalist. Daughter was brilliant, Adela Rogers. But if you read, what she has to say about him, and if you read some of the other, there have been no good biographies on him, and I hope to do one on him, but it's not going to come together. I mean, I was talking to a librarian at the Bancroft Library in California, and getting access to what I need for him, you just can't do it. It's crazy. It'll take forever, and I don't have that much patience right now. And so Darrow reaches out to Rogers, and as I'm reading these 8,000 pages, it's really clear that this guy dominates the courtroom. And it's also really clear that this trial's some sort of film, some sort of movie. So I knew this as I'm reading it, just like I felt like Nucky is something belongs on the screen. This belongs on the screen. And so I'm reading this, and I said to myself, I gotta get a literary agent who's a lawyer. Well, I did. And then he and I huddle, and we said we gotta find a producer who's got background in the law, and we found one. And so I don't know if he's gonna be the star of the movie, or if Darrow's gonna be the star, or Ruby's gonna be the star of the movie. One of those three is gonna sort of be the star of the movie. But this guy taught law to medical students, and he taught medicine to law students. He was the first person, I don't know if you ever heard of the term demonstrative evidence. Demonstrative evidence is things you take into the courtroom to help explain an issue. Could be a photograph, it could be, a part of a machine. But he was doing demonstrative evidence before anybody had even thought about it. He was doing it at the turn of the 20th century. He was doing demonstrative evidence. He was bringing skeletons into the courtroom. He was bringing bones. He was doing accident reconstruction. He was doing crime scene reconstruction. He was doing blow-ups of big photos. He used exhibits in Darrow's trial. And I get this one crude photo of the exhibits hanging up on the wall behind the jury. But he basically took control of the courtroom because he knew the law better than anybody else in the courtroom, including Darrow and including the judge. And the two adversaries, the district attorney and assistant district attorney, they were parapoliticians basically. One of them was a good lawyer, the other one was a politician who eventually ran for governor and lost because he made a fool of himself in this trial. I mean, he attacked one of the co-counsel with an inkwell, and all sorts of crazy things going on in this trial. I mean, and it was really a lot of fun to read, a lot of fun to write. But this guy, he may be the star of the movie or whatever. I'm not sure. He's an amazing character. Sad thing, and I have to tell you this. It's a bit of a downer. He was bipolar, I think, in a day when nobody was being diagnosed for that because nobody even thought of these issues. And so he medicated with booze. And at the age of 52, he told his daughter, I can't do this anymore. And he went and drank himself to death. Quite literally, drank himself to death. But left behind an extraordinary legacy because he handled so many trials in his day and he was so successful. And I tell people, as much as I admire Clarence Darrow, if you remove Earl Rogers, I don't know. Darrow could have been convicted in that trial because they wanted him bad. They wanted him so bad that they charged him with another person. There was a second trial. There's no transcript of that, and I think the reason the Los Angeles County Bar didn't bother to save another long transcript is because the testimony was all the same. And that trial was a hung jury. And Rogers was sick and wasn't in much of the trial. And so I'm saying to myself, if Rogers isn't around in that first trial, they could have convicted him. And we might never even know who Clarence Darrow was. I don't think Darrow was guilty. Some people think that he was. I really don't think he was guilty. But we're never really going to know because everybody's dead. And, the only evidence left remaining is the 8,000-page trial transcript that I read. And makes him look innocent to me. I mean, when you see how Rogers presents the case, it's fascinating. So that's my latest work. I got 2 other books that I'm on a path towards trying to figure out which one I want to write next, making her a little bit crazy in that process, because she has to hear about this one, she has to hear about that one. But I'll get there, you know, I'll figure it out. But I'm honored to have the opportunity to address you. So, any questions? I'm game for questions. Yes.
I want to know who's going to write the book about you. Because there will be one.
No, I hope not. Better not be her. So.
Was Earl Rogers a doctor that became a lawyer, or a lawyer that became a doctor?
He was a Presbyterian minister's son who started out his career as a journalist with not with the LA Times, but with one of the competing papers in Los Angeles. And he got frustrated and took law courses. In those days you didn't have to graduate from law school, but you had to sit for the law in another lawyer's office, and then you were examined orally and then told if you were eligible. But he had a fascination with anything that he thought might help a client. He really was very devoted to the law and extremely devoted to his client once he undertook representation. And he how do I say this? He was a genius. I have no doubt about that. And he was a genius attracted to the law because as a newspaper reporter, he covered trials, and he said, "Hey, I can do that." And that's how. And I discuss it in the book. One of the really sad sub stories in this book is that he had a friend. It was this gentleman's mom and his mom were friendly, and he was a lot younger than Rogers. He had a friend who was working for the LA Times, and Rogers would work late hours. His office was right across the street from the LA Times, and this young man would bring sandwiches or whatever, and they would talk in the evening, and Rogers would talk to him about how you interview somebody and get them to trust you. Because see, here's what I learned from representing the Atlantic City Press for 20 years. Reporters and lawyers are a lot alike, because they've got to get people to trust them before they'll communicate honestly. And Rogers was sort of the coach to this young man, and he was one of the 20 people who died. And so it was a really bitter pill. For Rogers was not pro-labor, he was not anti-labor. He understood labor's griefs, but for him to take on that case after his friend had died, for me, showed a great deal of professionalism, that he could just see past that. Like, I got a client to represent, and this guy's being screwed, and I got to help him. But now Rogers was the son of a Presbyterian minister who I think he had a couple years of college at Syracuse. And then the family moved west. He became a reporter, and then he studied law, and he became a lawyer in his 20s, and did have an amazing career. Really did, before he drank himself to death.
Thank you.
To make up more than you wanted, I guess.
Yeah, it's all good.
Just a comment. Growing up, regarding your family, everybody loved Jenny.
My mother was an amazing woman. I don't know how many people in here ever got to know her, but she was really special in her own way. And what I mean by that is, there wasn't a mean bone in her body. Would forgive anybody for anything. And when my father died, she did not take a vacation until I graduated from law school. She worked 6 days a week in the hardware store, because got to get this done. I was the one she was determined. See, she was forced to leave school when she was 16 because her father died, and she came and lived in Hamilton. And so education was really precious to her, and it was important to her that I get my education. And once she knew what I wanted, she said, "Well, 7 years, and we're just gonna have to stay at it until we get it done." But she would not let me work. And I did work hard during the summers, but hanging guardrail, okay, with Whitmire's and then statewide. Her attitude was, your job is to be a student full time, and that's what I want you to do. And I did it. And her attitude was, I'll stay at this until you're educated, and then I'll start taking vacations. And she didn't take any vacations until, but I'll tell you, I'll digress. To answer his question, I'll digress. This will tell you about my mother. 1972, I ran for school board. 1972.
You know where I'm going with this, right?
1972. Anybody remember Donald Crescenzo, David's father? Okay, well, he was my dentist, and I'm sitting in his chair. He has his hands in my mouth, and he tells me his former dental partner, Dan Pateri, had been on the school board, and Dan died of cancer, and there was a vacancy for a 1-year slot. And he says to me, you ought to run for school board. And I'm like, really? You know? And he starts giving me a sales pitch on why I ought to run for school board. Now, anybody remember that before 1972, we had 4 failed referendums in this town, and kids were going to school double session. Her brother was going to school in the dark, you know, like 7 o'clock in the morning. And then kids were going home in the dark. Where was your brother's Clinton? Masonic Hall?
No, he was in the lower part of the old building that doesn't
Okay,
exist.
but-
From 4th grade through 8th grade, he was on half sessions for those 4 years.
For 4 years, he was on half session, okay? Because some went to school early in the morning and some went to school in the afternoon into the early evening. And so Donald Crescenzo was telling me, you ought to run for school board. So I do, and I get elected for that first 1-year term, and then I got elected after that for another term. So it's like 1973, we are now pushing for a new school, another referendum, hopefully this time we're gonna succeed. And so we had this big public hearing in the auditorium at the high school, because the high school that I graduated from on Liberty Street, because we're trying to get a referendum passed for the elementary school, which is on 4th Street now, all right? 2 of the speakers that get up to talk in support of the referendum are sitting very close to each other. One's Pete Marinelli. Anybody that I know, a couple of you will know who Pete is. Pete was the last justice of the peace in Hamilton under the old Constitution. He was a gas station owner. He was known by everybody. He was a character too. Okay, but a wise, uneducated man, very wise, and very respected. And my mother. They were like 2 of the first people to speak in favor of him. And I'm sitting next to Donald Crescenzo, and he goes like this. He said, those 2, they're worth about 400 votes. And I said, that's why you wanted me to run for school board, for my mother's votes. Okay? And we were successful. My favorite, and now you're forcing me to digress, Bill. But here's my favorite story about my mother. Yeah, so I'll try to get through without. I'll try to smile about it rather than cry. 1975, I run for what's now the county commissioners. My opponent is Peter Parisi, who'd been mayor 4 times in Hamilton. He's running for re-election as freeholder. I knew I could compete with him in Hamilton. I knew I would lose to him in Hamilton, but I knew I could compete with him in Hamilton and not get clobbered. And again, because of my mother, I knew I could compete with him. She was a good campaigner. Very subtle, okay? Very subtle. Because that's how she was. And she grew up in Newtonville, as I told you. And one of her friends in Newtonville was a gentleman named Wilder Hines. And she tells me, you ought to seek out Wilder. So I do seek out Wilder, and he and I become very friendly. And he had shopped in a hardware store, and the relationship was still good between him and my mom. And elections, and I proved this to a large number of people. Do you remember what year did Emily graduate from high school?
2005.
2005. Do you remember the referendum in 2003 for the new high school? Anybody remember that? Okay. I sat down with Sam Donia, who was then school board attorney, and he said to me, would you help organize the vote? And I said yes. And I had Rick Gillespie and I had Brenda DeMarco, and we organized a really good effort. And the closer we got to the election, I started counseling people. And I'm going to explain to you why. Forget about undecided voters. Forget about people that you have to convince. We're now focusing on people who have told us they'll vote yes. And to hell with everybody else. And I want everybody to make up a list of who you know is going to vote yes. And then she has connections with the Electrical Workers Union through ACIT. They come to town, we give them the lists, and they're knocking on doors, and they're driving people to the polls. And after all that effort, we won by 23 votes.
Jeez.
Okay? My effort running for school board a lot of years earlier, running for the Board of Freeholders a lot of years earlier, I knew that I was going to have problems because Pete Parisi and Hamilton. And my goal was to not be beat by 500 votes. My goal was to be beat by less than 500 votes. And then my goal was to beat him in Mullica Township, run neck to neck with him in Hamilton Township, not get beaten too bad in Buena Borough, and then beat him in Buena Vista Township. That was my goal. Okay, so I wind up winning by 75 votes. Okay, and there was a recount and everything, but I wound up winning by 75. So the night of the election, we knew we had won, and I had focused on in Buena Vista Township. I had focused on Newtonville. It's District Number 4. I think it's still called District Number 4. And Wilder had the same mindset, which is we got to get everybody out who's going to vote for Jenny Benson's son. But that's how he campaigned, Jenny Benson's son. Okay, so the night of the election, and we know we won. We're having this big get together at the Mount Carmel Society Hall. Ralph Ficciatola was active with the society, and he was a Democrat, and so that became our headquarters for the night. And my mother's there, and she wants to see Wilder. And I'm calling Wilder, and I'm getting no answer on the phone. And so he was like me, he was an early riser, so I called him the next morning around 6:30, and I said, Wilder, where were you last night? My mother wanted to see you. And he said, I won Newtonville like 123 to 17, and I only won by 75 votes. So I knew where I won. I won there, okay? Along with other places, but you got to go to your strength. And Wilder says to me, I can't believe the 17 people who voted against Jenny Benson's son. And so he was upset. He was disappointed. I said, you didn't expect a clean sweep. He said, why not? So that's my favorite Jenny story. And I got a lot of favorite Jenny stories, but that's probably my favorite. Any other questions? Well, okay, I talked your ear off. I'm sorry about that, but I've enjoyed myself and I've enjoyed being here. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I have all 4 of those books. If anybody's interested in any of them, they're to keep it simple, to different prices, but they'll all be signed, each $20. You don't pay. You don't pay.
Charge him extra.
You don't pay.
Charge him extra.
Well, no, you gave me Irving Stone's hardbound. I've got about 5 versions of Irving Stone's book, but
Okay.
yours is the most precious to me. Okay. Well, my pleasure being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.